in general. And I also won't give so many details about the empirical case studies of my dissertation, because I'm more interested in general arguments than engaging in specific details. So I will first try to define what I understand as metatheory, and some people who are in favor of using metatheory in empirical research, and others who are like more skeptical towards that. And then see how I try to navigate these two views of metatheory and translate critical realism into specific methodological guidelines with regards to inference strategies, research questions, literature review, methods, the power dynamics between people who participate in the research, and the writing phase. And then I would just wrap up saying what's ahead for me and what are some preliminary conclusions that we can draw. I will try to stay close to 40-45 minutes, and then I would like us to have a conversation. So the structure of my dissertation so far, I think it's typical for critical realists in terms of, in the first chapter, I'm interested in discussing the relevance of metatheory for our work and arguments and counter-arguments against. And then I present the critical realist ontology. In the second chapter, I try to explore how critical realism can inform our methodology. My main research questions here are two. I want to know why people are against energy policy in my country, in Greece. And the second one is whether what we describe as collaborative methodologies is helpful when it comes to explaining a phenomenon. And in chapter 2, I also describe a psychological theory that we can use to understand this phenomenon. And my overall aim is to see how this psychological theory can be juxtaposed with the ethnographic theory, the empirical research, when it comes to the explanatory strength of both. So this is the first part, which is mostly about metaphysics, psychology, and methodology. And the second part is more about history and collaborative ethnography. And this split matters. It's a statement that I will try to explore later. So chapter 3 is written by myself, and I introduce the historical context of two energy policies. The one is decarbonization in Western Macedonia, the region where I come from. And the other energy policy is hydrocarbon extraction in the Mediterranean Sea. Chapter 4 is co-written with an activist, a coal miner from Western Macedonia. And chapter 5 is co-written with an activist from the anti-hydrocarbon movement in Greece. So in chapter, in the third part, in chapter 6, these last chapters are written by me as well. And in chapter 6, I try to address the first question, which is what is the explanatory strength of a specific psychological theory and empirical research. And in the last chapter, I actually try to address the second research question, that is about participatory collaborative methods and their potential, their complications for psychological research. So overall, I engage with anthropology, philosophy, and psychology as three social sciences and humanities. So when it comes to defining metatheory, I usually use these two metaphors before I get into specific details. People have used the metaphor of hydrodynamics. Lakatos, a philosopher of science, has said that maybe this is a bit of a speciesist claim, but he said that most scientists tend to understand little more about science than fish about hydrodynamics. He advocates mainly for the engagement of scientists with a meta level, like a second order level of reflexivity about what we do. And another critical realist took up this metaphor, the metaphor of hydrodynamics, to also say that he gave this example, that somebody can be a very good swimmer, even if they don't know the laws of hydrodynamics, let's say. It's not a requirement. But if the swimming school that you attend has a wrong theory about how water works, then it's definite that you won't be able to swim very well. I usually use the metaphor of chess, and I love playing chess. And I think that if we compare it to empirical research and meta theory, you can be a very good chess player, even if you don't know, let's say, the meta theory of chess. But at some point, you will stop improving, and then you need to engage with second order reflexive level. For instance, if you know that if you occupy the center of the chessboard, you will probably win the game. Like this is an example. Meta theory, I use the word meta theory interchangeably with the word metaphysics and ontology to refer mainly to the nature of being, the nature of reality. It's a distinction that comes from the work of Aristotle. Some people who classified his work made this distinction between physics and metaphysics in the work of Aristotle. The main, if we try to present people who are in favor of using meta theory in empirical research, I think is that this is something that unites all of us, that we all have an ontology and we all make assumptions about how the world works. If we don't engage with this meta level, then we are lost in what we can describe as, in anthropology, ethnographic particularism. We are lost in endless empirical details, and this obstructs communication and dialogue. While meta theory is something that we all have in common. Trying to read what people have said about meta theory. Ritzer, he has proposed 3 types of meta theorizing. One is that we study theoreticians, we study how theories produce, the social and cognitive context. The second one is people who just study other theories in order to produce a new theory. And he says the third one, the one that I'm interested in here, is that we study other existing social and anthropological theories, for instance, in order to produce an overarching meta theory. But what's interesting is that Ritzer says about sociology is that before meta theory was even established as a subfield, there were intense criticisms against the use of it. And it's somehow similar to anthropology as well. In anthropology, there is this distinction between what is described as the 4-field approach, where we have linguistic anthropology, social anthropology, physical anthropology, and archaeology. And Garber discusses the prospects of a fifth field, which is meta-anthropology, a field of meta theory in anthropology, let's say. He says that there are several factors why this has been dismissed as a potential. But what is important is that there was a historical debate between armchair anthropologists who didn't do empirical fieldwork, and fieldwork anthropologists. And eventually there was a winner, which was the idea that anthropologists can only conduct empirical research, ethnography, and there is no other potential. A debate that shouldn't have a winner from my perspective anyway. So I just want to emphasize here that meta theorizing is an underdeveloped practice, and there has been explicit or implicit dismissal of this potential. I think that it's only the historical approach that can contextualize a relationship to meta theory. I won't dive into that, but I just want to say that in psychology was developed as a discipline that emerged out of philosophy, actually. But then there was this idea that in order for us to become scientists, we need to extricate ourselves from philosophy. And then we had the dominance of experimental approaches and numerical approaches. In anthropology, I think that it's a bit different. In anthropology, there was a lot of theory produced, grand theories, structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism, etc. But especially after the reflexive turn in the 80s, I think that more and more anthropologists are becoming skeptical about engaging with these more metaphysical questions, to put it that way. There are also external political pressures, I think. The publish or perish culture. I was reading this article by the physicist Peter Higgs, was saying that he wouldn't be considered productive enough in today's academic system. And that means that the long-term arduous engagement with these complex metatheoretical frameworks becomes almost impossible today, or really difficult. And I just, to summarize, I was saying that there are internal developments in psychology and anthropology that have led us to a specific take on metatheory today. But I think that it's also external political pressures. And there are consequences and implications when it comes to the dismissal of explicit engagement with metatheory. One of which is it's difficult to reflect on the quantity of empirical studies that we produce today. And for instance, one of the top studies in the top cited studies in the social sciences, well, this is one of the findings that happy people smile more. If we don't have this meta level of engagement, I think that it's difficult to say that this cannot be the best we can do when it comes to social science research in terms of commonsensical findings, that things that we already know. So there are people who strongly criticize our engagement with meta theories, and I think that let's say there are main two arguments for me. The one is that if we commit to specific schools of thought, then this, what Lake would say is that we end up prioritizing ideological loyalty over serious engagement with empirical facts. And he suggests the alternative of open-ended, flexible kind of cherry picking, let's say, between various schools of thought. I would say that for me, this is another metatheoretical paradigm again, which I would describe as analytical eclecticism, for instance. There are also criticisms against the engagement with philosophical metatheory, to put it that way, in terms of the universal applicability of the set of assumptions that inform specific metatheories. There are two examples that I read about. The one is Melanesia and the other the Amazon, two regions that are kind of the sphinx that is tantalizing to the Western mind. They kind of challenge dominant assumptions in the West, if I can put it this way. Strathern did research in Melanesia, and she said that several of, let's say, Western feminists and anthropologists who went there, they reinforced assumptions about alienation that come from commodity-driven societies, but they are not applicable to gift economies in Melanesia, for instance. And a set of binaries, public, private, structure, agency, meet their limits in some regions. Another anthropologist, Viveros de Castro, did research in the Amazon. What I would say as a critical realist, the most critical realist, that, for instance, capitalism depends on human agency, but gravity does not. He would say that in some regions in the Amazon, the autonomy of natural facts is questioned as such. So the whole argument here is that, for instance, the distinction that we make between culture and nature, that I think we should advocate for this distinction. It's important, but the whole argument here is that some set of assumptions are not universally applicable, and we should be skeptical. The outcome of this is what Dacol and Greber would describe as ethnographic theory, which means that the strength of anthropology is that we bring critical concepts from the fieldwork rather than overshadowing these concepts with philosophical meta theories, to put it that way. And they say that this is the strength of the discipline. Some decades ago, it was actually people like Freud would take concepts from anthropologists and indigenous communities, like the concept of totem and taboo that Freud uses. Well, now it's the opposite. It's actually anthropologists more and more, the terms that they use are the territorialization, governmentality, and they just express their concern with this, the relationship between philosophy and ethnography. And they use the term they describe as ethnographic theory, which means that our engagement with empirical research can provide theoretical insights as well. One of the classical examples that we have discussed with Lee is this picture that is the Wolfman's dream. This was a very well-known patient of Freud. And the critique against Freud here was that Freud was willing to stick to his own metatheoretical assumptions and interpret this picture as part of Oedipus complex, rather than listening to the patient and not overshadowing what the patient says. So I will now, let's say this is a summary of the arguments in favor of and against meta-theory. I will now jump to the second part, which is how I'm trying to navigate these dilemmas, these complexities between these two views of meta-theory. I gravitate towards the first. I think that we should use meta-theory, but some of the arguments that the other people provide are important. The return to ethnographic theory that Cole and Graeber advocate for, I think that now in anthropology has gone too far. And there are some anthropologists that actually argue that the only thing we can do is to, let's say, record and catalog the ontologies and epistemologies that exist out there. Right? That it's only, all of our questions can be deferred to the ethnography. I would say that this is a similar claim that we might meet in some branches of psychology, that all of the questions are deferred to the experiment, that it is this critical experiment that can resolve our own epistemological problems. For instance, some anthropologists would say that if we, let's say, imitate the way truth is understood in some indigenous communities in Cuba, this is going to resolve our own epistemological problems. So while we should advocate for ethnographic theory, when it goes too far, it would be described as ethnographic foundationalism, which is a mystical belief in the power of ethnographic description to reach back and resolve anthropology's own epistemological dilemmas. And I'm going to say that most critical realists are interested in explanation and causality. But with ethnographic foundationalists, this actually means that we kind of live in anti-explanatory times, because if more and more people advocate, let's say, for a post-critical, non-judgmental epistemological stance, the vision here is that we just catalog, archive ontologies and epistemologies that exist out there. So there is a pushback against explanation, because the main task is to describe what exists. And then, because we discuss emancipation here in this seminar, the idea is that if we just describe and multiply the worlds that exist out there, this is a threat to the dominant Western ontology, to put it that way. For me, it's a bit of a dystopian vision. I don't think that our role is just to describe. And this is why I'm using explanation in my dissertation. This is a book that I recently read, and addresses several of the problems when it comes to explanation in anthropology. For instance, I will use this quote from Holbert and Peterson, who are advocates of the ontological term. They say, conceptualization in this sense is the trademark of the ontological term, just as, say, explanation epitomizes positivist approaches, and that of interpretation typifies hermeneutic ones. The ontological term often involves showing that such why questions, explanation, are founded on a misconception of what? Conceptualization. The question of why certain people might believe in nations, say, or ghosts, may be raised precisely because questions as to what a nation or a ghost, and indeed what belief and doubt might be, have not been properly explored. Here we have two arguments against explanation. I think that the first is wrong. It's not just that I disagree. The idea that explanation epitomizes positivism is dominant in anthropology, but I think that it's not just critical realism, but several other conceptions of explanation, Max Weber and others. But this is a dominant assumption in anthropology, I think. The second argument, I think that to me kind of makes more sense. And in my research, I would say, for instance, that the first step should be to understand how energy is conceptualized before we jump into explaining why people are against some energy policies. So I would conclude that we need to be aware of the limits of explanation sometimes. So when it comes to induction inference strategies, I think that there are these main four that most social scientists use. I would say that in anthropology, the most dominant one is induction, which refers to the idea that we start from some empirical facts, bottom-up knowledge, and then we try to produce theory. Deduction is kind of the opposite. It's the idea that we start with some theoretical premises, and then we either verify or falsify them. Abduction is an inference strategy through which various explanatory theories are compared. This is what I'm going to do in chapter 6 of my dissertation. And retroduction, I think it forms kind of all part of my dissertation. It's a movement from manifest phenomena to unobservable structures and mechanisms. I would say that when it comes to induction and deduction, the problem with deduction is that it's difficult to generate new knowledge because what you actually do is just test existing theories. So it's difficult to produce novel knowledge. And with induction, I think that it's kind of impossible to entirely generate bottom-up knowledge. So I would say that I personally use a flexible deductive analysis. I start with some premises that come from critical realism, but then I try to be honest and open about the assumptions that I make, and then try to build ethnographic theory. So I would say a mix of deduction and induction. A next step that is the research question. Some anthropologists don't like using this term because it sounds scientific, but I think that we all want to learn something, regardless of whether we frame it as a research question or not. Let's say some learning objectives. I think that the dominant tendency in the social sciences is what we describe as the dictatorship of the problem. It's the idea that it's the specific research question that is going to determine the methodological decisions that we make. I think that from a critical realist perspective, we would say the opposite. We would say that metaphysics takes precedence over methodology, and it's our own metatheoretical position that has methodological implications. So I'm saying this to just remind that starting from a metatheoretical position here means that I'm interested in explanation and causality. And then the research questions are framed in such a way how the ethnographic theory and the theory of planned behavior that we try to explain now explain opposition to energy policies. And this is an endeavor that has some complication, right? Because we compare psychological theory with ethnographic theory to distinct set of assumptions. And then the other question is also about causality, actually. And I'm asking what's the potential of collaborative approaches. Another part, I'm just trying to show that there are different methodological decisions that we make, and the way we navigate the skeptical view of metaphysics and the constructive matters. From a critical realist perspective, most phenomena, social phenomena, we see them as a laminated system. Which actually means it's a powerful metaphor just to say that there are multiple explanatory mechanisms coming from multiple layers of reality that we have to employ to build, let's say, a more holistic understanding of a phenomenon. This means that would criticize as reductionist, for instance, if I just employ a specific psychological theory that only engages with the psychological dimensions to explain a phenomenon. It's not illegitimate, but at some point we need to integrate different approaches coming from different disciplines. I just want to say that this is a strong metatheoretical take that from me comes from an emergentist conception of the world, like the idea that there are basic levels and higher order levels, which depend on, but are irreducible to basic levels. And to just expand on this idea, after reading all the literature on energy and why people are against all over the world, some energy policies, I think that, and relying on a laminated system approach, I think that some people say it's the economic causes matter here, namely, for instance, that there are poor working conditions in the global south. The technological level is important. A techno-optimism or techno-enthusiasm that doesn't actually address the problem. The political layer, the anthropocentrism, for instance, of some energy policies. Cultural, historical. For instance, here in Norway, there is a conflict between the Sami people, the only indigenous, recognized as indigenous community in Europe, and energy companies that want to install wind turbines. This is, it has to do with cultural factors mainly. Ethical, the ethical layer, which is what are the ethical visions behind its energy policies? How do we dream of the world and what should happen? Behavioral, that I would just mention now. Affective and environmental health. As I said earlier, I think that if we understand, for instance, the environmental health as the basic level, namely the biological health of humans and the biophysical systems, this has to do with the emergentist conception and how we understand the relationship between all this level has to do with metatheory, actually. I had the choice to choose between two psychological theories. The one is the theory of place attachment that primarily focuses on the affective ties we have with allocation and using this framework, try to explain opposition to energy policies. But I will focus more on the behavioral level, which is because I think that there is dominance of behavioral economics today. I think it's important to discuss this approach in specific. I just want to say that the behavioral paradigm is still very dominant. And in environmental psychology that I try to read about, 50% of the articles that are published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology are about behavior. And again, this is a meta-theoretical take about the subject of psychology, that it should be behavior. There are also several quantitative studies in this specific field of environmental psychology. I use the theory of planned behavior, but I don't want to test it with quantitative theory, right? I want to refine and explore how we can, what are the limits of this approach. Briefly, what this approach says is that attitude toward the behavior, which is whether we think that if we engage in this behavior, there will be positive outcomes. Subjective norms, which if I oversimplify, refer to the significant others and what they believe about this behavior. And perceived behavioral control, which is whether we feel that we have control or there are external constraints over engaging in this behavior. And that mainly the model says, there are several revisions of this model, but the model says that it's these three variables that affect the intention, and then this eventually affects the behavior. This model has been applied a lot to understand opposition to energy policies, these three variables, let's say, for instance. I want to say that the founder of this model is one of the superstars in psychology. He has received several accolades and awards for his work. And there was also a debate some years ago between psychologists. Some psychologists said that it's time to retire the theory of planned behavior on the grounds that it's what we discussed earlier as the happy people smile more argument, in terms of that we kind of make commonsensical arguments here. What are we saying? That if we intend to eat lunch, we will eat lunch. And other arguments against the theory. And of course, the proponents of the theory try to respond and defend the theory. I try to explore the assumptions of this theory, the psychological theory. And in the chapter 6, I will try to compare it with ethnographic theory. But I would just say that from a critical realist perspective, what are the problems here with this theory? First of all, the focus is on the control and prediction of behavior. This is a classical take in behaviorism. And what is the problem? That we need to be able to predict, especially in climate change research. We need to know how the future will be. But I think that from a critical realist standpoint, we are skeptical of prediction because of how the world is actually. What they say is that we shouldn't try to add more predictors as much as possible, regardless of the context of the research. And then the second quote, what says from me is that what reveals actually is how some psychologists relate to participants. They say that participants could be told that among the things that they can do is to reduce energy consumption and et cetera, et cetera. So the research setting in psychology, on some occasions, reinforces this idea that participants are just there to be told what to do. And this is a strong metaphysical take on how we relate to other people. It has to do with the socioeconomic conditions as well, how we are as workers, for instance. Um, and I don't want to say that in some branches of biomedicine, for instance, it doesn't make sense that participants are told what to do. But I think that we need to think about what this means, actually. So another step is the methods and analysis of the material. I used ethnography in my work, and I analyzed newspaper articles, interviews, field notes, scholarly articles, and then I had the structure of my the chapter, and then I discussed it with my collaborators, and they made some changes, and then we had the final thing. I just want to say again from the perspective of explicitly engaging with metatheory, we can use ethnography, but because of our metatheoretical assumptions, which is in the case of critical realism, the idea that ethnography is actually the canonical form of causal explanation, that we need quantitative research to understand the relationship between events, but it's only through ethnography, historical analysis, and narrative that we can approach causality in deeper ways. So I was asking questions about causality, right, and events, or what circumstances exist right now that are favorable to the actions of your initiative, for instance. I used thematic analysis to analyze all the material for two reasons. The one is that there has been a lot of discussion in critical realism about thematic analysis. And the other is that because I collaborate with non-academics, I think thematic analysis is relatively accessible. It's difficult to use discourse analysis, for instance, because there are so many terms that I don't know if it would make sense to non-academics. I used, out of the three critical realist approaches, I used the one suggested by Christodoulou, and it has to do with the fact that in this approach, metatheory is introduced at a later stage, and this brings us back to the fear that it's our metatheory sometimes that overshadow the empirical material. So out of the three, I think that this approach has a disadvantage at least. The collaborative paradigm, I just want to discuss whether this is compatible with critical realism or not. These approaches, collaborative, participatory approaches, have a history that date back to indigenous communities thousands of years ago. They have been mainly developed in the last century. And like action research, collaborative archaeology, collaborative ethnography, et cetera, et cetera. I want to just briefly mention that the compatibility with critical realism. The one is that if we understand the world as an open system, this means that we need to engage in interdisciplinary collaboration to understand its complexity. In my case, it's not under interdisciplinary collaboration because my collaborators are not scientists, but they are people with deep knowledge of the specific field. Another idea is that we need to take into account the object of the study. It's the object of the study that offers specific cognitive possibilities. In my case, I work with these energy initiatives, these two energy initiatives, that work through horizontal decision-making processes. And this means that if we have to take into account the object of the study, we cannot use traditional models of the lone researcher, right? Because this is questioning the initiatives as such, because they work with this horizontal way. Also, I think that what Lee would say that sometimes lay approaches might be better than scientific knowledge. For instance, if we compare the psychological theory that has these three variables and what I will now present as the ethnographic theory, we see that it might be richer in terms of how we understand the context. And also, I think that the critical realist quest for emancipation is compatible with some radical social movements. But here there is a critique. There is the critique that we can engage collaborative research only with these radical movements. What happens with nationalists or religious fundamentalists? And I think that this is a limitation of collaborative approaches. So these are the two people with whom I collaborate. Stefanos is a coal miner, and Venetia she's the founder of the Save Greek Seas website. We have written together some academic papers and also made some presentations. I just want to report an experience that I had during the St. Andrews Post-Philical Writing Up seminar, where Stefanos participated. And my fellow students started asking questions about our collaboration, the power dynamics, and all these questions. And I think that for members of energy initiatives, these are not questions that we would expect, because our focus is primarily on criticizing energy policies. It's not on our positionality or the disagreements that we have with each other. And then the professor of the seminar, I find it very kind that he started explaining why students ask questions about the collaborative dynamics, because of the reflexive theory in anthropology, blah, blah, blah. And I think that this is why collaborative approaches might be important, because they facilitate this two-way communication, right? What happens in anthropology and the social sciences is of interest to other people, and it can be explained in various ways. So I'm approaching to the conclusions, just to say that with Stefanos, we write this chapter, what we describe as CO2 orthodoxy, and trying to follow what the Greber would describe as ethnographic theory. What I find important is just try to elaborate on the model that Stefanos and other people in this community use, without resorting to a critical realist terminology necessarily. At least in this stage, in part 2, for instance, the idea that we develop of CO2 orthodoxy, this can be framed as a critical realist problem. Critical realists also discuss it as CO2 reductionism, for instance. The idea mainly that carbon emissions is a very important problem, but it's not the only one when it comes to climate change, because climate change is a phenomenon consisting of multiple causal chains. So this is the model that Stefanos primarily uses to understand the problem of energy policies that has to do with the health implications, labor, nature, and geopolitics. In the other chapter about hydrocarbons, we talk about the sonic warfare of neocolonial hydrocarbon politics, and we try to elaborate on this model. I want to say here that for me, it matters that at this point, we're not enthusiastic about metatheory. For instance, there are important concepts that we try to use. One of them is neocolonialism. And I think that if we just try to understand how neocolonialism is used as a framework here, what do people mean when they say neocolonialism, and how this can inform debates in the academy? Or another concept that we use to explain opposition to energy policies is the investor-driven state, which discusses how investors and state kind of merge. Which again, I think that if we just try to discuss and elaborate on this idea, it can inform debates in the academy about state power and investors. We could also use, for instance, Archer's morphogenetic model to understand this problem. Perfectly legitimate. But I think that it's important if we just give some conceptual space for these ideas and concepts first to emerge before we bring them into a dialogue with critical realism or any other approach. I would like to present this to the next conference, what we describe as sonic warfare. And I would just want to say that this can be framed again as a critical realist problem. And I refer specific to the fact that whenever there are military exercises in the Mediterranean or hydrocarbon extraction, because they use some dangerous sonar or sound waves to detect whether there is oil or natural gas in the sea, and because sperm whales and other whales in the Mediterranean use sound to see the environment, their aquatic environment, we have this constant conjunction of events, let's say, that whenever there is hydrocarbon extraction, seismic surveys, we occasionally, let's say, see mass strandings. And I think that through critical realism, we can think a lot about this problem and how this can inform the way marine biologists debate this correlation. And to conclude, so in the next chapter, I want to compare the theory of plant behavior with what we established as ethnographic theory, taking into account the complications of this endeavor. And in the last chapter, I'm going to write about, as I said, the complications of collaborative approaches, and is it a response to the epistemological violence in psychology? And by epistemological violence, we mean the tendency to interpret the data always in ways that portray the other as inferior. This is how it's defined in this context. So overall, I try to navigate between what we discussed as ethnographic foundationalism and what we can see as metatheoretical foundationalism. Namely, the idea that we can stick to pre-existing metatheoretical assumptions on the one side, or the other idea, I find both of them problematic, that it's empirical research that can give us answers to all of our questions. This is a claim that is made sometimes in the relativistic terms, right? That we should treat the academy and the people outside of the academy as producing, let's say, equal forms of knowledge. I'm not there personally. I just think that we should be critical towards everybody. I think that I'm trying to use critical realism, and this is what I focused on, as a methodological resource, as a metatheory that can empower our methodology, and also as an ethnographic resource. Mainly, I'm interested in using, let's say, doing an ethnography of the critical realists as people who are interested in explanation for good reasons. But at least in part two, I'm not that much interested in critical realism as a conceptual resource, mainly because of the critiques that there must be some conceptual spaces for concepts that come outside of the academy if we want to explore their emancipatory potential. And the last, I don't do this in my dissertation, but it's something that I would like to do since I work with people outside of the academy to discuss whether critical realism makes sense to them, or even the psychological theory that I explore. And I would like to conclude. I would just say that my friends at St. Andrews bought this hat for me. I don't like the allusion to Donald Trump, but I think that it's a slogan that we can use to provoke. Yeah, thank you.